Assalamu alaikum. Hello, dear students. The title of this lecture is Domestic and Familial Issues in the Anglophone Indian Novel. And of course, this lecture is part of our course, World Literature. And I am Dr. Maha Salam, Associate Professor of English Literature. Today's lecture is a brief extract from Chapter 7 entitled Domesticity and Gender in the Anglophone Indian Novel. It's taken from a book by the famous critic Prayamvada Gopal. The title of the book is Oxford Studies in Post-Colonial Literature, the Indian English Novel, Nation, History and Narration, published by Oxford University Press in 2009. In this lecture, we are going to illustrate how the familial and the domestic were used by the novels, the Anglophone Indian novels, to represent the grand narratives of nation. And this argument has long been advocated by the subaltern historian Ranajit Guha. So let us begin our lecture proper. Critics usually argue that all third world novels, not just the Anglophone Indian ones, but third world novels in general, are to some extent national allegories, or another expression, we can call them epic narratives, preoccupied with history and nation. Now, this claim applies to the Indian novel in English, which is the focus of our course this semester. Rabindranath Tagore wrote about this theme, the connection between the home and the world, and how the home and the world impact each other mutually, and how this mutual influence results in strong and unique narratives represented in the genre of domestic or familial fiction, so that in this genre, when we are talking about a novel that belongs to domestic fiction or familial fiction, the setting of the novel is usually the home. Events are happening in the home. The plot unravels in the home. And the themes are related to family tensions and family relationships. They are related to such issues as emotion, gender, sexuality, and of course the drama of everyday life. So whenever we have such a novel which is set in the home and which deals with family relationships and with tensions, sometimes there is the issue of marriage or child-parent relationship or financial trouble or any such theme, do not be deceived by the seeming limitedness of the plot you are reading or of the novel you are reading. Try to see it as like a national allegory. Try to find the connections between the novel and the big issues of history and of the nation. And this is why having like a firm foot about the historical background of India, especially around the time of the late 19th and throughout the 20th century, this will be like of paramount importance to you to properly understand the novels in our course. The beginning of this genre of domestic fiction in India started in the late 19th century. So this is the first feature or the first fact that we know about this genre. The late 19th century should remind you or should strike a note with those students who have been attending the course since the beginning, that this is around the time when we had the establishment of the Congress Party in India, and after a few years To be exact, in 1906, we also had the second party of the Muslim League in India, and we are familiar with the struggle for independence that was led by the leaders who belonged to these two parties. So it is not like a coincidence that around the time when the struggle for independence in the Indian subcontinent against the colonial regime of the British Empire, when this struggle started, around the same time the genre of domestic fiction began. This shows the intimate relationship between them. Another feature related to domestic fiction is that women writers had a marked presence as authors of this fiction. Of course, there were some authors who were male writers, but there is like quite a remarkable percentage of the authors of this fiction who are women writers. Maybe because it is something related to the home and something related to family issues, and usually, at least in the late 19th century, these were more related to women than to men. Now, before the flourishing of the genre of domestic fiction, there was a period of flourishing of another genre, a related but slightly different genre known as personal memoirs or autobiographies. We are familiar, of course, with autobiographical writing, and in the case of autobiographical writing, the author, she or he, they claim to be like giving us the narrative of their lives, of what happened, like not as a fiction, but in the realist mode, and trying to be as true and accurate as possible to what happened in their real lives. So, before the flourishing of domestic fiction in India in the late 19th century, there was a period when autobiographies and personal memoirs written by educated men and women flourished, and this dimension, this autobiographical or personal dimension, actually continued even when the genre of domestic fiction flourished. Always the texts, although they were mainly fiction, but they had like this autobiographical strain in them. Like many of the characters or the places or the events were based on real life events that happened to the author. Now, most of the examples of domestic fiction in India were written in the many indigenous Indian languages. And I want you to keep in mind two of these indigenous languages in particular, Urdu and Bengali. These two indigenous languages, like they had the majority of the number of texts of domestic fiction were written in them. And also English was of course used by several authors of this genre. Moving to another fiction or another feature of domestic novels, these novels usually focused on or emphasized or stressed the representation of minority communities in India. Most of them were about Muslim communities or Jewish communities, and we know that Muslims and Jews are a minority in the Indian subcontinent, but this was one of the features of this genre. Now, part of why this was the case is that the minorities, especially around the time of the late 19th century, now the official sense of communal identity among members of minority groups in the Indian subcontinent was enhanced by the codification of the personal law that governed family and civic issues for these minorities. This happened during colonial and post-colonial times, We are not going to get into details about the personal law, but just to let you know that personal law governs or controls family and civic issues like issues about marriage or divorce or inheritance. These issues, they are controlled or governed by different laws according to one's religious faith or one's group affiliation. So such a law, the passage of the personal law and its codification under British rule, was actually an enhancing or stimulating factor that caused the people belonging to these minorities to feel like a sense of solidarity or communal identity, and this sense was one of the features that was depicted in many novels, actually scores of novels belonging to domestic fiction. Many of the authors themselves belonged to Muslim minorities and Jewish minorities. And many of the characters and the events of the novels were dealing with the lives of these minorities. Now, a further feature of domestic novels is that some of them had what we can call an ethnographic approach. They were addressed mostly, some of them, we are not talking about all, but some of these domestic novels were addressed to a non-Indian audience or to a European audience. And because of this, these novels that had an ethnographic approach, they tried to explain the traditions and the customs of indigenous society or local society to foreigners or to people who do not belong to this society. So all these are features of the genre of domestic familial fiction. Now we are going to very briefly discuss two examples, two novels belonging to this genre of domestic familial fiction. The first is a novel written by Attia Hossein. She is a lady Indian author, and the title of her novel is Sunlight on a Broken Column. The novel was first published in 1961. This novel was set in the home of an upper-class Muslim family in northern India during the transitional period to provincial autonomy in 1935. This is the time in which the events of the novel take place, up till full independence in 1947. This is the time period that is treated within the novel. From 35, when certain provinces in northern India started to hear some news about getting autonomy or self-rule as a transition in preparation for like full independence. And between this time of 35 till the actual time of independence of 47, this is the time span of Attia Hossein's novel. And of course, I don't need to remind you that the independence theme in the Indian subcontinent is a very traumatic one because, as we said, it was like a mixed blessing or joy and tragedy intermingled together due to the tragedy of partition or what happened during partition. Of course, such a period, if you imagine that somebody belongs to a Muslim family in northern India during the transitional period from autonomy till full independence and partition, it would be a time of great turmoil and great chaos, especially to families who owned large areas of agricultural land. The Muslim families depicted in the novel were actually very rich, landed, feudal Muslim families. And suddenly they were told that they will be displaced from their homeland, the only homeland they have ever known, and their ancestors, their grandfathers, their great grandfathers have been living there for centuries. And suddenly to be told that you will be displaced from this homeland and you will go to a faraway ideological homeland. Of course, we are calling Pakistan here the ideological homeland because to these Muslim families, they were told that Pakistan, the land of the pure, will be the land of all the Muslims. So all the Muslims will leave India and go to Pakistan, and the opposite will happen. The Hindus and the Sikhs will leave Pakistan and come to India. And of course, such a thing is going to be very troublesome to people who have never known any other homeland except where they are living. Sometimes even one single family would be divided by the political borders. The people who are the cartographers, the politicians, the authorities who were responsible for drawing the maps and for deciding that this would be the border between India and Pakistan, these authorities, they did not care about dividing families. Maybe one brother would be on one side of the border and another brother would be on the opposite side, and the two families would be divided forever. And as you know, there was all this displacement, people leaving the south going north and people leaving the north and coming south, and all the loss of lives and the things that we have discussed in detail before, and the loss of possessions as well. So this was the time setting of Attia Hossein's novel. In the first two-thirds of the novel, Attia Hossein uses the ethnographic mode. She depicts the life of ordinariness and luxury, like a rich feudal landed Muslim family living in northern India. They are having their own love affairs, their own quarrels, weddings, funerals, tensions, meals. We are given details about the customs and the traditions of these people. Then, after the first two-thirds, suddenly in 1935, this like golden age is swept away by the uncertainties and the tensions of the transitional period. As we said, the family will suddenly discover that they will have to leave and go to live somewhere else, to leave their home and their homeland. Many decisions related to individuals and families and even community affairs, they had to be postponed or cancelled or changed in one way or another, so that the public and the private became very intermixed. The protagonist of Sunlight on a Broken Column is Layla. That's the name of the protagonist. And it is very interesting that this protagonist, Layla, bears many similarities to the author herself, Attia Hossein. She seems to be writing a sort of fictional autobiography. Her novel is, of course, a novel. It belongs to fiction or fictional discourse, but there is this autobiographical element that we were talking about in the many similarities between Attia Hossein and the novel's protagonist, Layla. They both come from similar backgrounds, Muslim land-owning rich families, and these families, they were privileged in so many ways and marginalized in others. Can you see the paradox? Usually, if someone is privileged, they would enjoy like status, authority, power, wealth, respect. And if someone is marginalized, we usually think of them as like poor or ignorant or dispossessed or so on. But in the case of these upper class Muslim families, the paradox was that they were privileged if we talk about money and education and culture, and they were marginalized if we talk about how in their country, their native country, their India, they were not like adequately represented in parliament or in running the affairs of their country. Layla recounts the tragedy of dislocation from the home of her birth, and the title of the novel comes when Layla decides to return home in order just to take a final look. She feels very nostalgic. She misses her home. She decides to return for a final look before leaving forever. And when she returns, she finds that this is home, this is the home that I know, but it is not the same. It is different. It has been already taken up by Hindus refugees who themselves were dislocated from their home in Pakistan. So can you see the double tragedy? The people who are living in Layla's home, they themselves feel like this is not our place. We are just refugees. We are staying here away from home. Where is home to these refugees, these Hindus refugees? It is actually in Pakistan. So all these personal tragedies intermingled with the public or the national tragedies, they were very accurately and movingly depicted in Attia Hossein's novel. So we can consider that her novel, Sunlight on a Broken Column, as she takes the final look at her home, is a novel that narrates change. Change happens in lives of individuals, in families, in communities, and even on a national level. We will discuss a second example of the genre of domestic familial fiction in the Anglophone novel, and this time it will be a novel by Ahmad Ali entitled Twilight in Delhi and first published in 1966. This is another well-known novel of transition, and it is also, like Hossein's novel, it is also set in a feudal Muslim family. And this novel, Twilight in Delhi, is about, according to the words of the author himself, Ahmad Ali himself, described the novel, saying that his novel is about the decay of a whole culture, a particular mode of thought and living. Maybe he is focusing on certain families, but he wants to tell us that it is not just these families who suffered from decay, it is a whole culture, the culture of Muslim families living in Delhi. Delhi was the old capital of India. Of course, you know that the Indian capital now is New Delhi. It was built to the south of Delhi, the old capital, and usually when you build a new capital, the old capital becomes a bit wasted. It turns into a sort of wasteland. It is like in a state of decay. Every day things are lost there because the new power center of politics and economy move away from the old capital to the new capital, and all the important people move and leave the old city and start having homes in the new city, so that the original inhabitants of the old city, they feel like they have been abandoned. Many of the inhabitants of Delhi were Muslim families, and at least in Ahmad Ali's novel Twilight in Delhi, the focus was on the fate of elite upper-class Muslim families of Delhi. These families were also, like Hossein's novel that we just mentioned, they were living in what can be called a golden time, and it was a time of flourishing of the great Urdu poetry about love and about great images and so on. And when Delhi deteriorated and decayed, and when the people of Delhi had to be displaced from it, or the very few who remained there, the Muslim families of Delhi who had to be removed, the very few who remained, they felt abandoned and marginalized. And there is a symbol used by Ahmad Ali in the novel, which is that the Urdu poetry, actually the novel, has many quotations and many examples of the great, beautiful Urdu poetry. And these examples are written in Urdu but translated and explained in the footnotes of the novel's text. And when we see these great examples of poetry, and we see the contrast between the beautiful poems and the condition of the people whose language was Urdu and whose sentiments were related to this poetry, we can feel like how these lines, they belong to a bygone time, and the theme of nostalgia is very much present. Now we have finished our lecture, and let me just remind you very quickly that in our course, World Literature, we need to know about the beginnings of this course as an academic discipline. We need to know about the contribution of the following names. We need to know about Goethe and about Marx and Engels. Then we need to know about Auerbach and Spitzer. We also need to know about David Damrosch and his great contributions. This would give us a sense of what world literature as a course or an academic discipline is all about, and what it tries to fulfill, and what did each of the names I just mentioned contribute to the development of this discipline. Then we focused our course on the Indian novel in English. We mentioned that this would entail a solid background of the history of the Indian subcontinent around the times of independence and partition. We talked a lot about such names as the great leaders Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, and Muhammad Ali Jinnah. We talked about the tensions, we talked about the reasons for partition and about the tragedy that happened, and also about independence. Then we discussed a number of novels, like we discussed The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy. We discussed The Lives of Others by Neil Mukherjee. We talked a lot about A Suitable Boy by Vikram Seth and Midnight's Children by Salman Rushdie. And we also added today two further examples, the domestic familial novels represented by Sunlight on a Broken Column and Twilight in Delhi. You would need to know the details of these texts and to try to connect them and link them with the big issues, the issues of partition, the issues of such themes as Gandhi and Nehru were representing in their books Hind Swaraj and the Discovery of India. You would need to be like able to link or connect the history with the narrative of the nation, because all these novels are national allegories. Thanks a lot, and wishing you the best of luck.